Reading Theories of Authorship, a Reader by Caughie. Introduction. The cinema is quite simply becoming a means of expression, just as all the arts have been before it, and in particular painting and the novel. After having been successfully a fairground attraction, an amusement analogous to boulevard theater, or a means of preserving the images of an era, it is gradually becoming a language. By language, I mean a form in which and by which an artist can express his thoughts, however abstract they may be, or translate his obsessions exactly as he does in the contemporary essay or novel. That is why I would like to call this new age of cinema the age of camera stylo. Andre Astruc, 1948. The Politique des Auteurs has had its day. It was only a stage on the way to a new criticism. Faridun Haveda, 1961. As a term, Astruc's camera stylo, camera pen, failed to take root, but the association of the film artist with the quote serious end quote writer and the instance on film as individual self-expression had a considerable polemical importance, forming the basis of the cinema d'auteurs constructed in the pages of Cahiers du Cinéma in the 1950s. Traditionally, the reference to the auteur in French film criticism had identified either the author who wrote the script or, in the more general sense of the term, the artist who created the film. In the work of Caughie, the latter sense came to replace the former, and the auteur was the artist whose personality was, quote, written, end quote, in the film. Within its distinguishable currents, Cahiers in France, Movie in Britain, Andrew Sarris in America, auteurism shares certain basic assumptions, notably that a film, though produced collectively, is most likely to be valuable when it is essentially the product of its director. Quote, meaningful coherence is more likely when the director dominates the proceedings, end quote, Sarris. That in the presence of a director who is genuinely an artist, an auteur, a film is more than likely to be the expression of his individual personality, and that this personality can be traced in a thematic and or stylistic consistency over all or almost all the director's films. Most auteurist critics made a distinction between the auteur and the mere metteur en scene, the one consistently expressing his own unique obsessions, the other a competent, even highly competent filmmaker, but lacking the consistency which portrayed the profound involvement of a personality. The distinction opened out energetic controversies along the borderline between the two. Over Minnelli, for example, or Minnelli, or Houston. Each of the currents had its own set of values and its own set of areas of privilege, and within the currents there were differences, but each seemed to assume that if film were to be considered an art, as it quite generally was, then what they were urging inevitably followed. Film is an art, and art is the expression of the emotions, experience, and, quote, worldview, end quote, of an individual artist. The business of introducing this section of auteurism is made considerably easier by the presence of Edward Boscombe's article, quote, Ideas of Authorship, end quote. Simply to repeat the points of Boscombe's critique would be redundant, and it seems more useful here to fill out something of the place of auteurism within the history of film criticism and theory, giving an indication of the history into which auteurism intervened, and the history which it initiated. The history, that is, of the before and after, which is implied by the two quotations which head this introduction, and which finds a starting point in the extract from Abrams, which follows. Ironically, the intervention of auteurism, its critical revolution, was simply the installation in the cinema of the figure who had dominated the other arts for over a century. The romantic artist, individual and self-expressive, established film criticism had long ago accepted that film was an art. It was the necessary justification for its own discourse, but it had meant it at the most general level, at which art has something to do with truth and beauty. Film theory had concerned itself most exclusively with the relation between the representation and the real thing, and had not developed an aesthetic to explain the place of the artist in film art. Since the cinema, which was predominantly valorized, was the less apparently industrial cinema of Europe and Asia, the problem of the apparent contradiction between a commercial industry and an art was not fully confronted, and where it arose, as in the films of Ford, Wells, and Griffith, it tended to be dealt with either in terms of overriding genius or by a compromised position in which, by a combination of exceptional circumstances, a good subject, a good script, a good cast, an artist, and freedom, a work of art which was personal might be produced despite the constraints of the industry. Established criticism valued as artists a small number of directors, predominantly European, who produced work which had a certain highly variable quality of, quote, greatness, end quote, which was typically either a moral quality or a social penetration, and a certain, quote, seriousness, end quote, which involved the apparent commitment of the artist to his theme. Art was simply a value term, and the theoretical questions which it begged went largely unanswered. Auteur criticism, on the other hand, proposed as artists a much larger number of directors whose work, viewed over a number of films, displayed a consistency of underlying theme and style which was surprising in the industrial and commercial system in which they worked, and which, therefore, it seemed, could be ascribed to the force of the director's personality and unique obsessions expressing themselves through the film despite the constraints. In fact, the struggle between the desire for self-expression and the constraints of the industry could produce a tension in the films of the commercial cinema which was lacking in the quote art, end quote, cinema, encouraging the auteurist critics to valorize Hollywood cinema above all else, finding there a treasure trove of buried personalities, and in the process scandalizing established criticism. uniqueness of personality, brash individuality, persistence of obsession, and originality were given an evaluative power above that of stylistic smoothness or social seriousness. Put thus, the critical shift which auteurism effected within the history of film criticism can be seen as a step backwards to a romantic conception of the artist as it is described by Abrams, a regressive step precisely at the moment at which romanticism was becoming less secure in other branches of criticism, and in a medium in which an aesthetic of individual self-expression seemed least appropriate. This regression can be explained partly by the lack of definition which had been given the notion of film art in traditional criticism, a lack of definition which allowed auteurism to pour cinema into the mold which was already provided by the romantic aesthetic. The relation between auteurism and romanticism also helps to explain the process by which, after the initial scandal, auteurism was easily assimilated into the dominant aesthetic mode. But if this succeeds in explaining away Astruc's, quote, new age of cinema, end quote, as nothing more than the old age of romanticism, it fails to explain the relation of auteurism to the, quote, new criticism, end quote, which Hoveyda evokes or invokes. If we describe auteurism as nothing more than an escape into the romantic aesthetic of bourgeois criticism away from the actual conditions of production, we pose it as simply a dead end of history, albeit one which is still with us. My argument would be that auteurism did in fact produce a radical dislocation in the development of film theory, which has exposed it progressively to the pressures of alternative aesthetics and, quote, new criticisms, end quote. This dislocation cannot be attributed easily to a single cause, but can be associated with a number of impulses, shifts of emphasis, and contradictions which were central to auteur criticism. In the first place, the shift which auteurism effected was a shift in the way in which films were conceived and grasped within film criticism. The personality of the director and the consistency within his films were not, like the explicit subject matter which tended to preoccupy established criticism, simply there as a, quote, given, end quote. They had to be sought out, discovered by a process of analysis and attention to a number of films. The recognition that the director was not always able to choose the best subject matter for his own self-expression was the concession which auteurism made to the conditions of production. Subject matter, the story, what the film was explicitly about, could in most instances be posed as a framework given to the director by the studio, and not necessarily of his choosing. The business of the critic was to discover the director within the given framework, to find the traces of the submerged personality, to find the ways in which the auteur had transformed the material so that the explicit subject matter was no longer what the film was really about. Quote, the story of the criminal sinners on a racetrack robbery, but this is certainly not the subject of the film, end quote. Film criticism became a process of discovery, a process which, while it remained firmly within the hermeneutics of romantic criticism, forced a more precise attention to what was actually happening within the film than had been customary for a traditional criticism, which tended to be satisfied with the surfaces of popular films, assuming that the conditions of their production prevented them from having depths. More than this, auteurism forced an attention to what was actually happening in a lot of films. New auteurs were discovered like new stars in the sky, and Andrew Saris in particular insisted on a rigorous and comprehensive knowledge not only of each putative auteur's output, but also of as much of the total output of all cinema, and particularly of the undiscovered Hollywood, as it was physically possible to see. This attention to individual films, to groups of films, and to the whole of cinema was, of course, necessary, beneficial, and, in the context of the history of film theory, progressive. In one form, the attention involved simply a discovery of recurrent underlying themes, giving to the critic the role of interpreter, separating the true from the apparent, finding the depth below the surface, easing the object into consumption. While the awareness of recurrent themes is clearly useful, there is a continual danger in predominantly thematic approaches that they will lend themselves to a critical reductiveness, a quote eureka syndrome, end quote, in which the aim is to quote crack the code, end quote, to liberate the theme and the values from the film which contains and conceals them. Because of the fundamental and perpetual difficulty of quotation in film criticism, of quotation from a visual discourse in a verbal discourse, thematic analysis, which verbal discourse copes with by repressing the visual, tended more and more to establish itself in many of the currents of auteurism, emerging clearly in, quote, auteur structuralism, end quote. Elsewhere, however, auteur critics avoid reductiveness by a close attention to mise-en-scène, and much of the best auteurist criticism, Barry Boyes on Minnelli, Hoiveda or V.F. Perkins on Ray, focuses on mise-en-scène as the stylistic, quote, signature, end quote, of the director, complicating a simple elaboration of themes with a constant return to the way in which they appear on the screen. The logic of this attention is clear within the auteurist project, given the conditions of production in which subject matter and script are likely to be in control of the studio. Style at least has the possibility of being under the control of the director, and it is there that his personality may be the most legible. Mise-en-scène has a transformative effect. It is with the mise-en-scène that the auteur transforms the material which has been given to him. So, it is in the mise-en-scène, in the disposition of the scene, in the camera movement, in the camera placement, in the movement from shot to shot, that the auteur writes his individuality into the film. While the motivation for this attention to mise-en-scène may be within the project of discovering and celebrating auteurs, it also raises questions of the effectivity of the visual discourse. In auteurist criticism, mise-en-scène begins to be conceived as an effectivity, producing meanings and relating spectators to meanings, rather than as a transparency, allowing them to be seen. Look, Millet's notorious, quote, morality is a question of tracking shots, end quote, appears less scandalous than it did to the critics of sight and sound. if it is construed to indicate an awareness of the relationship between strategies of mise-en-scène and the production of ideologies. More than that, the attention to mise-en-scène gives criticism a way of accounting for the text as pleasurable, pointing to its fascination as well as to its meaning. An almost hedonistic pleasure in visual delights is a feature of much of the writing in Caughie in the mid-1950s. Hoiveda on Ray, quote, "If one insists on thinking that Party Girl is rubbish, then I proclaim, quote, long live this rubbish, which so pleases my eyes, fascinates my heart, and gives me a glimpse of the kingdom of heaven," end quote. And it frequently lapses into mere formalism. But when one places Caughie's development alongside that of the more soberly traditional journals, it is hard not to sympathize with Bazin when he says, quote, "At least in Caughie, we prefer this prejudice to its opposite," end quote. In many respects, the attention to mise-en-scène, even to the extent of a certain historically necessary formalism, is probably the most important positive contribution of auteurism to the development of a precise and detailed film criticism, engaging with the specific mechanisms of visual discourse, freeing it from literary models and from the liberal commitments which were prepared to validate films on the basis of their themes alone. If this is the positive contribution of auteurism to film criticism, the eventual theoretical dislocation which it produced is more accurately attributed to the contradictions which it exposed within the aesthetics of film. Auteurism was not itself a theory. Caughie proposed it as a policy. Saris was prepared to admit it was more of an attitude than a theory, and Movie refused theoretical elaboration. But by adopting a fairly consistent romantic position in relation to creativity, it exposed film aesthetics to the contradictions of those romantic principles of individual creativity which formed the basis of 19th and 20th century criticism when applied to an expressive form which was collective, commercial, industrial, and popular. The contradictions of a resolutely romantic aesthetic in relation to cinema came to be generally recognized, and two modes of coping with them were developed. On the one hand, a certain inappropriateness was recognized, and the rules were relaxed to allow creativity, even creative dominance, to enter at other levels. A Paddy Chayefsky film, a James Cagney film. This approach characterized the later work of the writers associated with Movie. On the same level, the critical approach could be given a greater adequacy and flexibility by introducing principles of genre and industry, situating the auteur or author as one level among several which produce meaning in the text. Such a, quote, liberal auteurism, end quote, is indeed more adequate to the conditions of cinema and escapes much of the inappropriateness of earlier auteurism, but insofar as it tends to seek for alternative unifying and ordering principles, personnel, or relationships, it is still closely tied to the romantic aesthetic and causes little disruption in theory. On the other hand, and more radically, the attempt to confront the contradictions of auteurism within cinema aligned an important section of theoretical work on film with a more thoroughgoing critique of the romantic conception of authorship, which depended on the notion of a unified and free creative subject. It is the course of this project which the later sections of the reader attempt to chart. The decisive intervention is perhaps that of the editors of Caughie, whose work on the Ford film Young Mr. Lincoln constructs the text as a play of tensions, silences, and repressions, in which the author is a problematic, quote, inscription, end quote, rather than an intentional source of meaning, a personality, or a principle of unity. No straight line can be drawn between this work, or between the work on the author as fiction and function, which dominates part 3 of the reader, and the more intuitional, impressionistic work of early auteurism. But it is clear that the Caughie editors' text did not emerge from nowhere. The work of Kamali and Narbani on Ford in this section of the reader seems to indicate a pull between the recognition of the auteur as a system of consistencies and the film as site of repressions and contradictions, and Saris imposing, quote, interior meaning, end quote, as a tension between the director's personality and his material, already hints at unconscious meanings and at the author's constructed a posteriori, whose names Peter Wolin will later put into inverted commas. Auteurism was at its most productive in its contradictions, and the systematic and rigorous attempt to confront them marks a shift out of auteurism as a critical policy towards work on a theory of authorship. It would be absurd to suggest that the subsequent history of film theory followed necessarily from the radical intuitions of auteurism. What I am suggesting is that the foundations of a number of developments in authorship theory were already present, untheorized, in the work of those auteur critics who were more concerned with the productivity of mise-en-scène than with the simple identification of the auteur's thematic preoccupations, that the present concern with film as language or film as discourse marks a return to a more rigorous concern with the rhetorical figurations of mise-en-scène, a return which has frequently lacked the ability to account also for film as pleasure, and that other developments in film theory have followed, particularly in Caughie's from the need to rationalize the massive contradictions of an untheorized and assumed romantic auteurism, the tendency to reject auteurism because it is, quote, hopelessly contradictory, end quote, loses sight of the extent to which subsequent authorship theories and subsequent theories of the production of ideologies in films were at least inflected, if not initiated, by these contradictions. Equally, the tendency to reject auteurism because it is, quote, hopelessly romantic, quote, lends itself to an overreaction in which the author appears as, quote, nothing but, end quote, an effect of the text, failing to elaborate what the effect does. The attempt to move beyond auteurism has to recognize the place in which auteurism occupies and the influence which it brings to bear. It has to recognize also the fascination of the figure of the auteur and the way he is used in the cinephile's pleasure. A final point has to be added to free auteurism from the historical confinement which the association of the term with a particular period of Caughie implies. Auteurism is a critical approach which existed before Truffaut announced, quote, La politique des auteurs, end quote, in 1954, and persists after the Young Mr. Lincoln text of 1970. Lindsay Anderson in the late 1940s in Sequence was already writing about John Ford in a way which anticipated the best of auteurism, even to the point of distinguishing in a Sight and Sound review between Ford's Wagon Master and Wise's Two Flags West as, quote, the difference between the expressive poet's eye and the elegant, superficial skill of the decorateur, end quote, and Robin Wood in 1975. Block quote, Hawks obviously isn't the sole creator of To Have and Have Not, but I still value it primarily as a Hawks movie. His unifying and organizing presence seems crucial to its success. End of block quote. Auteurism now, even more than in the polemical situation of the 1950s and early 1960s, is a critical rather than a theoretical practice fully accommodated within established aesthetics, less concerned in its security to defend itself or rationalize itself. Within film criticism, in fact, from being a dislocation, it has become the tradition, producing evaluations and interpretations which are frequently impressively and seductively perceptive, but which very seldom throw into question in any rigorous way the premises on which the cinema depends. The attention necessary to contemporary auteurism is not as a theory, but as a critical position within discourses about cinema, a position which is supported institutionally and ideologically by the, quote, received, end quote, cultural aesthetic. A position, that is, which defines the space in which other discourses about cinema take place. And I was reading the Introduction to Theories of Authorship, a Reader by John Caughie.